And here we are. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. And it's Monday morning, July 28th of 2025. And it's time for part 6 of Undo the Coup. This one I have stolen the chapter title from Donald Gibson's book, The Kennedy Assassination Cover-Up. And chapter 5, The Cover-Up was an establishment project. So let's get into the reading after we hear the music. And welcome once again to McDuff Lives. I'm John O'Loughlin, and this is part 6 of our series, Undo the Coup. The caption is, The Cover-Up was an establishment project, and that's the language of the title of Chapter 5 of The Kennedy Assassination Cover-Up by Donald Gibson, published in 1999, republished in 2014. And I have the later edition here. If you have the 99 edition, you can sell it for $717 on Amazon. So I won't be getting that. But you can. So, I spent a bit of the weekend going through this book, which has been on my shelf for a while. I read it once years ago, and because I think it's so important that we stop looking and trying to figure out, how many guys pulled triggers, where were they, the details, was it the Corsicans, was it the Cubans, was it, the White Russians, who was it? No, that part of it has been rendered into meaningless speculation by the great Wurlitzer, the CIA's ability to put out all kinds of stories and have prominent journalists and television stories and everything that they need at hand. And isn't it interesting? Isn't it interesting that today we are seeing the investigation of what is being called another coup? The coup of the intelligence services, I guess, against President Trump that began in December of 2016, just before his first term began. And I was just watching Matt Taibbi on the Megyn Kelly show, and where I left off was right where I wanted to start with this show, and that is that first they created a desired outcome of the investigation. Then the media went to work pushing that desired outcome. In the case of President Trump, the desired outcome of the intelligence community was that the people would believe that there was Russia collusion in the 2016 election. That was the desired outcome. And then suddenly that was out in the newspapers and the television all of a sudden before they had even conducted the investigation. Well, that's what's going on right now. And one of the things that you will see is the parallels between what Tulsi Gabbard is calling a coup d'etat and what really was a coup d'etat, if my humble opinion, on November 22nd, 1963. So yeah, let's dig into what Donald Gibson comes up with. I've read the book through already, but I want to start with chapter 5 because that's really on point with my point today in part 6 of Undo the Coup, the 63 coup. Starting on page 125, the cover-up was an establishment project. And this very beginning is very important, in my opinion. Listen to this. Participants in a criminal conspiracy do not have to be fully knowledgeable of all the relevant events, nor of the overall aims of the conspiracy. They can be more or less witting, be involved prior to or following a criminal action, be directly or only indirectly active in support of the conspiracy, and be minor or major contributors. In this chapter, we will examine the relationships among the individuals who participated, wittingly or unwittingly, in the cover-up. Those who did not know what they were involved in should have known. These individuals made up the three groups that we have been discussing: those in the media who created the cover story in the hours immediately following the assassination, the group that persuaded President Johnson to create the Warren Commission, the group that controlled the operations of the Warren Commission. A fourth group, discussed later, turned Lee Oswald into a patsy. The framing of Oswald was part of the cover-up. Let's go back to the very first one. The media who created the cover story in the hours immediately following the assassination. So you see, it is the corporations that control the media. The government doesn't control the media. The corporations are controlling the media. Now, obviously, yeah, since World War II, there's been military control as well. But look at the method here. First, you convince the public that your conclusion is true. Then you do the investigation to prove that your conclusion is true, and you exclude everything else. All of these men played important roles in the cover-up. There is no direct evidence that any of them had knowledge of the assassination before it occurred. I have no direct evidence that any of them knew who it was that ordered the assassination. Their participation in the cover-up may have been on a no questions asked basis. Their roles may have been limited to specific tasks, like getting the commission created or blaming the assassination on Oswald. It is possible that none of them had any direct factual knowledge concerning the assassination. Whether conspirators or co-conspirators, whether the involvement was before or only after the fact, regardless of how witting their participation, these men did oversee important stages in the cover-up. The cover-up was in a couple of ways like a relay race. Each phase of the race was run by a group, not an individual. The cover-up was conducted in a series of stages, and the early stages had to be executed with sufficient speed to prevent any other account of the events from becoming influential enough to force an honest investigation. The official cover story that Oswald did it alone and did it because he was a nut or a communist nut had to be immediately disseminated. As we have seen, this was done through the media. The patsy in this intentionally confusing mess also had to be eliminated to prevent him from talking and to prevent a serious investigation. After the initial dissemination of the cover story and the elimination of the patsy, the next two stages were the creation of and the control of the official investigation. The first of these two stages, as described earlier, was carried out directly by Eugene Rostow, Joseph Alsop, and Dean Acheson. The second stage was supervised by key participants in the investigation. Someone orchestrated the overall investigatory process, and it was not, with one exception, the Warren Commission counsel and staff. Most of the counsel and staff had no authority over the general direction that was taken by the commission. The obvious supervisors of this stage of the cover-up were Allen Dulles, John J. McCloy, Alan Belmont, and the lawyer who was installed as chief counsel by McCloy, J. Lee Rankin. These men, with support from Gerald Ford and the compliance of Earl Warren, supervised this stage of the cover-up. They constituted one team in a relay of teams. They were connected to the Rostow-Alsop-Acheson team, from whom they took the baton. All of these men had at least one close relationship with someone else involved in the process. Usually, there were multiple relationships. The network. Among these men, there was probably no one who had performed a greater variety of important services for the establishment than John J. McCloy. In fact, there may have been no one in the country who had handled so many difficult and important tasks on behalf of the higher circles. McCloy was the utility player par excellence for the inner core of the upper class establishment. At the time of the assassination, McCloy's resume included the following, quote, partner in the Morgan-related law firm of Cravath, de Gersdorff, Swain, and Wood from 1929 to 1940. Assistant Secretary of War, 1941 to 45. President of the World Bank, 1947 to 49. High Commissioner for Germany, 1949 to 1952. Chairman of the board of what was initially Chase National and then Chase Manhattan Bank, 1953 to 61. Trustee of the Rockefeller Foundation and chairman of the Ford Foundation. Chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations since 1953. Director of United Fruit, Union Pacific Railroad, Allied Chemical, AT&T, Metropolitan Life. Wow. It's just unbelievable, isn't it, that one man has all of these connections and incredible career, owing, of course, to his incredible, connections, right? The network. Among these men, there was probably no one who had performed a greater variety of important services for the establishment than John McCloy. In the 1950s, McCloy became the representative of and troubleshooter for the major oil companies and the bankers who financed those companies. He would continue in that capacity into the 1970s. McCloy handled some of the personal affairs for the Rockefeller family, and he worked with Robert Lovett and Averill Harriman on behalf of the Union Pacific Railroad. McCloy was involved in controversial matters such as the decision to place Japanese Americans in internment camps during World War II and the decision to protect and use high-level Nazis after the war. McCloy was related by marriage to Lewis Douglas, an heir to the Phelps Dodge money, who was president of Mutual Life Insurance Company and a trustee of the Rockefeller Foundation, and to John S. Zisner, a longtime director of J.P. Morgan and Company. With the establishment, McCloy was one of the establishment's most versatile, experienced, sophisticated, and trusted agents. No less trusted and sophisticated was Allen Dulles. Like McCloy, Dulles had long-standing connections to both Morgan and Rockefeller interests. Dulles came from a family with a long history of involvement in the upper levels of private and public power. For example, his grandfather was Secretary of State in the Harrison administration, and an uncle was the chief foreign policy advisor to President Wilson. In the years prior to World War II, Dulles had various government jobs relating to foreign policy and practiced law with, drumroll, Sullivan and Cromwell, yay! By 1935, at age 42, he had become sufficiently important to be the representatives of the Council on Foreign Relations at a high-level conference in London. Dulles chaired the study meetings and gave one of the opening speeches. Dulles' service with the OSS during World War II led to his later appointment as Director of Central Intelligence, serving as director from 1953 to 1961 when he was fired by President Kennedy. Before the Warren Report was published, President Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana was shown a copy of the report. When he saw Dulles' name, he immediately said that confirmed his suspicion that the report was a cover-up. Eugene Rostow graduated from Yale in 1933, went as a student to King's College, Cambridge the next year, and then returned to the Yale Law School. Rostow became the dean of the Yale Law School in 1955. He spent an additional year at King's College, 1959 to 60, as Pitt Professor. Rostow worked at the State Department from 1942 to 44 as an assistant to Dean Acheson, then the Assistant Secretary of State. Later, 1966 to 69, Rostow was Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. Rostow was a member of the influential American Law Institute, a group funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, of course, to promote or develop legal policies for the country, or for the Rockefellers. McCloy, of course, was a trustee of the foundation. Joseph Alsop was in the early 1960s one of the most prominent journalists in the United States, and he was among the few journalists with high-level connections to the intelligence community. During World War II, Alsop worked as a speechwriter and public relations man for General Claire Lee Chennault when Chennault was in China. After the war, Alsop became deeply connected to the CIA, maintaining close relationships with people such as Richard Helms, Frank Wisner, and Ed Lansdale. Lansdale used Alsop as an outlet for propaganda about the situation in Vietnam. There's a claim that Lansdale was in Dealey Plaza when Kennedy was killed. The Alsop family was part of what Stephen Birmingham has called America's secret aristocracy. I would point out Stephen Birmingham, the author of one of my favorite books, Real Lace, about the Irish and the attempt of Irish families to rise to the elite only to get stricken down. Sounds familiar to me. Alsop came from a long line of Anglophiles. One of his ancestors, John Alsop, was a committed Tory who actively opposed the American Revolution. Joseph's mother was Teddy Roosevelt's niece. Dean Gooderham Acheson, Secretary of State under Truman, was born and raised in the United States, but his parents were Canadian. Whoa, how many Canadians are getting involved here? Louis Mortimer and the Bronfmans, all these Canadians. Bloomfield, Louis Mortimer Bloomfield. Acheson's family, like Alsop's, were Anglophiles. His mother, a member of the wealthy Gooderham family, was educated in England, and she probably contributed to Acheson's lifelong Anglophilia and his great admiration of the British Empire. Acheson, a graduate of Groton and Yale, viewed the majority of human beings as a, quote, vulgar mass, unquote. Okay, now we're starting to figure this out. He reportedly thought little of JFK and spoke of Joseph Kennedy as the social climbing bootlegger. Acheson backed Symington for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1960 with hopes of stopping JFK. Acheson served briefly as Undersecretary of the Treasury in FDR's administration, but left because of a policy dispute. This is similar to McCloy's brief service as arms control advisor under JFK. When Acheson was being considered for that Treasury job, Senator James Couzens, Republican from Michigan, accused Acheson of being as much an agent of the House of Morgan, quote, as anybody we could possibly put in the Treasury, unquote. Acheson was a partner for 3 decades in the Rockefeller-Schroeder-related law firm of Covington, Burling, Robley, Acheson, and Shorb. You know, I didn't know Acheson was ever part of Covington and Burling, but Covington and Burlington was like by far the biggest law firm in D.C. when I was practicing. He also served for 8 years as a vice chairman of the Brookings Institution, and he was involved during the World War II period in planning post-war international policy, including the creation of the International Monetary Fund. These 5 men shared much in common. They were all men of influence, status, and wealth. 3 of them, Dulles, Alsop, and Acheson, were members of the exclusive Metropolitan Club in Washington. McCloy and Alsop belonged to the Links and to the Brooks Clubs in New York. And Acheson belonged to the Century Club in New York. McCloy and Acheson, that is. All of these are among the elite social clubs in the United States. 4 of them, Alsop excepted, were members of the Council on Foreign Relations. 2 of them, McCloy and Dulles, were directors and officers of that high-level policy-making organization. The CFR was a significant organization because its members, and particularly its leaders, were bound together through a multitude of personal relationships. These men knew each other, and several of them had long-standing close ties to each other. James DiEugenio, Harold Weisberg, and a few other researchers have correctly portrayed McCloy and Dulles as controlling figures within the Warren Commission. We have looked at some examples of their misbehavior. Even Peter Gross's all-too-kind biography of Dulles, Gentleman Spy, The Life of Allen Dulles, states that Dulles tried to shape the investigation and that he prevented the exploration of some areas. As of 1964, Dulles and McCloy had been very close friends for over 3 decades. McCloy's Council on Foreign Relations study group recommended the intervention in Guatemala that was shortly thereafter carried out by fellow CFR officer Allen Dulles. While McCloy was at the Ford Foundation in the 1950s, he helped Dulles to get foundation funding for CIA activities. While he was chairman of the Chase Manhattan Bank, 1955 to 61, McCloy allowed the CIA to use that bank for its operations. Pardon me. All right. Nice to have a mute button. McCloy, with support from Dulles or Ford or both, imposed J. Lee Rankin on the commission. Dulles and McCloy imposed their views on the commission, giving the commission a goal, settling dust, and a conclusion to work toward. Oswald was the lone nut who did it. These 2 men had multiple connections to the group that imposed the commission on LBJ to begin with, connections beyond membership in the Council on Foreign Relations. They and the creators of the Warren Commission also had numerous connections to those in the media who initiated the cover-up. You know, this blows me away. I've been studying this stuff for a long time, and until I read that and read it a couple of times, I realized, wait a minute. They're saying the cover-up was initiated by the media. Yeah, it was. For example, Dulles's relationship with Alsop went back at least to 1940, when the two, along with Dean Acheson and Whitney H. Shepherdson, were members of an establishment group, the Century Group, formed to promote aid to Great Britain. Alsop was among a few high-level journalists who were among Dulles's steady social contacts in the 1950s. At the time that Alsop, Dulles, and Acheson were part of the Century Group, Dulles was a director of J. Henry Schroeder Banking Corporation, which had close ties to Acheson's law firm. Alsop once identified Dulles, Acheson, McCloy, and Lovett as examples of the Anglo-Saxon elite friends of himself and his brother Joe. McCloy was probably even closer than Dulles to Acheson. McCloy was for 30 years one of Acheson's closest friends and someone with whom he frequently worked. Like Dulles, McCloy worked with Acheson during the 1940s in the effort to promote assistance to Great Britain. McCloy supported Acheson when he came to the defense of accused traitor Alger Hiss. Acheson recommended McCloy as one of the high commissioners in Germany after World War II, and he recommended McCloy to JFK as Secretary of State. When Acheson's daughter married William Bundy, brother of National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, the wedding breakfast was held at McCloy's home. William Bundy worked under Allen Dulles at the CIA in the 1950s. McCloy and Atchison worked together on a variety of other projects. The two were part of a five-man group appointed after World War II to formulate a policy for the international control of atomic energy. They worked together on a post-war policy toward Japan, and they, along with Lovett, were offering advice to JFK during the missile crisis. They both supported escalation of the war in Vietnam after JFK's assassination. They were, with Dean Rusk, among the most vocal critics of Charles de Gaulle in 1967. According to Isaacson and Thomas, the wise men, the book The Wise Men, McCloy and Atchison shared an elitist disdain for democratic processes. Atchison and McCloy had a close personal relationship, and Atchison thought highly of McCloy. Both McCloy and Atchison, like Dulles, were closely acquainted with Joseph Alsop. McCloy's friendship with Alsop went back to at least the early 1940s. Atchison knew Alsop at least as early as the 1930s, and they became close friends, socializing with and writing to each other and working together with Dulles as members of the Century Group. The families of Alsop and Atchison had been close to each other for at least a generation. Atchison and Eugene Rostow knew each other and were a two-man mutual admiration society. Rostow worked for Atchison in the 1942 to 44 period when Atchison was Assistant Secretary of State. In his book, Peace in the Balance, Rostow described Atchison as, quote, an authentically great man, unquote. Atchison, in Present at the Creation, said that he considered Rostow one of his most important colleagues in that period. Atchison was a fellow of the Yale Corporation and Rostow the dean of the Yale Law School. Atchison supported the choice of Rostow to be dean in 1955. Rostow and Atchison, of course, got the ball rolling in the creation of the Warren Commission. One or more of these five men was close to or associated with other figures who played prominent roles in the development of the cover-up story. As head of the Domestic Intelligence Division of the FBI from 1951 to 1962, Alan Belmont must have had numerous contacts with CIA Director Allen Dulles. In 1960, Belmont and Dulles were among the 10 men serving as members of the United States Intelligence Board, an organization which provided intelligence estimates for the President and Congress. Mayor Earl Cabell, that's C-A-B-E-L-L, and pronounced Cabell as I later learned. Mayor Earl Cabell of Dallas, perhaps the first person to offer the lone nut theory, was also connected to Allen Dulles. Earl's brother, Charles Cabell, was Dulles's assistant. James Reston, one of the first and most important people in the media to label Oswald the lone assassin and to imply that he was insane just hours after the assassination, was close to Dean Acheson. In fact, according to Acheson biographer James Chase, Reston was someone with whom Acheson could plant stories. Reston was also close to McCloy. McCloy lived across the street from Reston in the 1940s and became an unidentified source for some of Reston's stories. Joe Alsop briefly worked for John Hay Whitney, or Jock Whitney as his nickname was, owner of the Herald's Tribune, and the two were well acquainted. Whitney was a millionaire publisher with all the right credentials. His education included Exeter, Yale, and Oxford. Whitney's father and grandfather were members of Yale's secret and elitist society, Skull and Bones. Commenting on George Bush's association with Skull and Bones, James Reston referred to the, quote, noble tradition of Skull and Bones, unquote. As noted in Chapter 2, Whitney was a Knight of St. John of Jerusalem and honorary commander of the Order of the British Empire. He was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Business Council. St. John of Jerusalem is a British kind of reproduction of the Knights of Malta that was created in the 19th century, 1870s or 80s, so to allow non-Catholics to call themselves knights of Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, but that is another name for the Knights of Malta. So those things are all connected. And of course, the Order of the British Empire, that's a very high decoration indeed. Whitney's granduncle was Oliver Payne, Payne, a partner with John D. and William Rockefeller in Standard Oil. For over 60 years, the Whitneys were close allies of both Morgan and Rockefeller interests. Jock Whitney was a friend of the Rockefeller family. Around 1930, the board of the Morgan-controlled Guarantee Trust Company featured Harry Payne Whitney, Cornelius Vanderbilt Whitney, W.A. Harriman, and Morgan partners Thomas W. Lamont and Grayson M.P. Murphy. MP, I think, stands for Malay Prévost, if I'm not mistaken. In the late 1930s, the Whitneys were also among a group of major stockholders controlling Newsweek magazine. That group included Paul Mellon, the Harrimans, and the Astors. The Whitneys were related through marriage to the Harrimans and the Vanderbilts, as well as to William Paley of CBS. Jock Whitney's cousin, Senator Stuart Symington, was, as indicated earlier, something of a great blue hope in the 1960s, i.e., a non-campaigning candidate that many blue bloods hoped could steal the nomination from Kennedy at the 1960 convention. Eugene Rostow, apparently the first person to act to get the Warren Commission established, served with Jock's brother-in-law, Charles Payson, Payson, on the board of directors of the Techstar Corporation in 1962. Across the upper levels of the media, there were many other secondary or indirect connections and associations. On the New York Herald Tribune board of directors with Whitney was Samuel C. Parker, Jr., an assistant to Whitney. Parker earlier in his life had spent 7 years with J.P. Morgan and Company. And in 1963, he was a member with Alsop and McCloy of the Lynx Club. Another member of the Lynx Club who was on board and who served as president of the Whitney Communications was Walter N. Thayer. Thayer was a director of the Morgan-controlled Bankers Trust and had worked for the law firm of Donovan, Leisure, Newton, and Lombard. Donovan, of course, was William Donovan. World War II head of the OSS, the forerunner of the CIA, Donovan worked for the Morgan Group early in his career. I don't think I knew that. Explains a lot. Whitney himself cooperated with CIA in money transactions, and there were personal connections to such high CIA officials as Frank Wisner and C. Tracy Barnes. Also on the board was Whitlaw Reid. Reid was, like Whitney, a member of the CFR, and he belonged to the Metropolitan Club with Dulles, Alsop, and Atchison. He was also a member with Dulles and Rostow of the Century Association. All of these Herald Tribune men, Reid, Park, Thayer, and Whitney, had been students at Yale. There were many similar associations at the other media institutions. For example, the publisher and a director of the New York Times, Arthur H. Sulzberger, was a member of the CFR, Metropolitan Club, and Century Association. He was also a trustee of the Rockefeller Foundation. 5 of the Times' 10 directors were members of the Sulzberger family. Another was married to a Sulzberger. Among the other directors was Eugene Black, who was an executive for 14 years with the Rockefellers Chase National Bank and went on to head the World Bank. Black also served as a trustee of the Population Council. Hello. Hi, eugenics. You guys are in too, aren't you? An organization created by John D. Rockefeller III in 1952. Another Times director, Amory H. Bradford, was a member of the CFR and Century Association and a trustee of the Carnegie Institution. Bradford's wife was Carol Warburg Rothschild Bradford. Wow, that's quite a name. Warburg Rothschild Bradford. The Warburgs and Rothschilds are 2 of the world's most famous banking families. Director Orville Dreyfus was married to one of Sulzberger's daughters. He was a member of the executive committee of the Rockefeller Foundation. There were also extensive links between Morgan Rockefeller interests and the other media mentioned here, i.e., Dow Jones, the Wall Street Journal, Time Inc., and Newsweek. McCloy, Dulles, and Atchison were themselves personally close to the Morgan Rockefeller interests. The cover-up was very much a private, not a government affair. Even though Belmont of the FBI was involved early on, the Oswald did it alone story was first promoted by the media. That is so important. And it's something that nobody's ever really focused on. I mean, he wrote this in 1999, but the book didn't really go anywhere. Well, guess why? Because it was right over the target. Rostow and Atchison intervened to get the commission created and, in the process, prevented Senate and House investigations. That's really important. McCloy and Dulles dominated the commission. This was essentially an establishment cover-up. Only an establishment network could do all of these things. Only they could reach into the media, the CIA, the FBI, the military, control of the autopsy, and other areas of government. Most of the men contributing to the cover-up operated at the upper levels of the establishment. All worked on behalf of the establishment. People like Whitney and Atchison were probably at a higher level in the pecking order than a James Reston or an Alan Belmont. This establishment combines old money with not so old big money. It is an amalgamation of Boston Brahmins and New York financial powers. Its power and influence is rooted in the control of strategic assets. The establishment owns banks, oil companies, and media, as well as an assortment of other corporations. Associated law firms protect its interests, and it uses foundations and think tanks to develop and promote parts of its agenda. Establishment families use all of their resources, but particularly money and media, to affect the electoral and political processes. Although they make deals with and have alliances with groups in dozens of countries, their primary international connection is to similarly situated factions of the British upper class. Anyone wishing to gain an understanding of these interests in the decades leading up to the Kennedy presidency or today would be well advised to begin with Ferdinand Lundberg's 60 Families, George Seldis's 1,000 Americans, and Carol Quigley's Tragedy and Hope and the Anglo-American Establishment, perhaps supplemented by G. William Domhoff's Higher Circles and David Kotz's Bank Control of Large Corporations in the United States. Given the role of these establishment members, Atchison, Dulles, McCloy, Whitney, Alsop, and Rostow, and agents of the establishment, Rankin, Belmont, Reston, in the cover-up, any connections between these individuals or other clearly related establishment interests and the interests leading up to the assassination are of obvious importance. There is only one individual that we know with certainty was significant in the period leading up to November 22nd. That person is the patsy, Lee Harvey Oswald. We do not know the names of the men who made the decision to have Kennedy killed. We do not know the names of the men who did the shooting. However, we do know now the names of the men who conducted the cover-up. Any connections between them and Oswald, especially in the period just prior to the assassination, are significant. In fact, setting Oswald up as a patsy would itself be part of the cover-up. Much of Lee Harvey Oswald's life was strange. There is probably no way to determine how much of that unusual history is directly relevant to his role as a patsy in the assassination. It may be much of his life, and it may only be the months immediately preceding the assassination. We will consider only those months. Oswald lived in two places during those months, New Orleans and Dallas. He moved to Dallas for his second period of residence there, only 7 weeks or so before the assassination. He moved to Dallas from New Orleans, where he spent the previous 5 months, that following his first stay in Dallas, which lasted about 6.5 months. Oswald's time in New Orleans has been examined in relation to organized crime through his connection to David Ferry or through his uncle, Charles Muret. to anti-Castro Cubans, and to various intelligence agencies. Only in a few instances has anyone bothered to look at New Orleans in relation to the national upper class, and particularly the New York-Boston establishment. In the next chapter, we will enter a history of intrigue and machination in Louisiana through a door that can be opened with a surprising key: the 1935 assassination of Senator Huey Pierce Long. We will look at Long and his death because his life and his death bear similarities to the life and death of JFK, because Long's opponents and enemies were much the same as Kennedy's, and because there are a variety of direct and indirect connections between the two men, the two eras, and the two deaths. And that, of course, is leading into Donald Gibson's next chapter, chapter 6, entitled Long and Kennedy. And I do hope I get a chance to read the next couple chapters of this book with you, because isn't that fascinating that he is referring to all this New Orleans stuff as obscure and not talked about, but it's all that we talk about when we talk about Ed Haslam and Judith Ferry Baker and Clay Shaw and Bannister and Garrison and all of that. So Alton Ochsner appears prominently in the next chapter, and these are connections that really excite me, because if we can convince the American people that, the cover-up is part of the crime, then we're going to win our battle to undo the coup. Well, I see we've got a number of folks in the chat room. Let me let's pop over there and say hello. Brightmore, and let's see. Brightmore Dinosaur, there was similar dissension among the 9/11 Commission. Several participants viewed the report as a cover-up by the NIST. Naturally, the media downplayed the conflict on the commission. Isn't that something? We're seeing a pattern here, aren't we? This is 3 indications that the media is the principal organ through which the establishment controls the American people. I think that's a point we need to take home with us. And among all of the other people we're looking to hold responsible for the coup against President Trump, for instance, but especially the coup against President Kennedy, we need to put the media up at the top of the list, because who are they controlled by? They're controlled by the establishment, the same people we just were talking about. Well, fascinating. Undo the coup, folks. Pass the word around. I put hashtag in front of it so that it becomes something you can share, and just kick around on Twitter or your social media. This is my hope, is that sometime during my lifetime, we can actually undo the coup. Thank you very much. I'll see you tomorrow with the great David Cranmer Underdown, back for another analysis of his amazing research. Thank you very much. See you then.